Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Amidst our politics today, there's no question that it's hard to separate the signal from the noise. The cacophony of the January 6th insurrection on the U.S. Capitol still reverberates. Trump's speech, the impeachment, the damage and injuries, and the possible complicity of House members in providing aid and comfort to the rioters. One other image that endures from that day is the clenched fist of Missouri Senator Josh Hawley. Interpreted by most as political opportunism run amok, a hyper-ambitious young senator who should know better, trying to gin up and capture the votes of the Trump base. It fits perfectly with our cynical view of politics. But does it represent something else at play? Does Hawley, a graduate of Stanford and Yale Law, represent some other strain or some other definition of populism, of religion, and of white supremacy that isn't QAnon, but in many ways is more sinister and more embedded in the American experience? Does Hawley actually provide a kind of intellectual underpinning of religious extremism and religious nationalism that lies at the heart of Donald Trump's base? And if so, what does it mean for our future? If you understand this better than my guest, Katherine Stewart. Katherine's work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. She's the author of the previous books, The Good News Club, an investigation of the religious right, and The Power Worshippers, a look inside the dangerous world of religious nationalism. And she's the author of a recent New York Times op-ed on the roots of Josh Hawley. It is my pleasure to welcome Katherine Stewart back to the Who, What, Why podcast. Katherine, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
One of the things, and we've talked about this before when we talked about your book, The Power Worshippers, is that it's really a mistake to try and understand all that's taking place, all that took place at the Capitol a couple of weeks ago, and understand the Trump base and the state of our politics today without really looking at the religious underpinnings of this. Talk about that in a general sense first.
That's true. I mean, what was on display in January 6th is the fact that there is a political movement in the United States that is hostile to both truth and democracy. And the movement has a number of roots, and the alliances between many of those who stormed the Capitol with racist and white supremacist groups is abundantly clear. But no analysis is really complete if it fails to take into account the role of Christian nationalism. We really can't understand what happened that day without looking at the powerful role and exploitation of religious rhetoric and the deep connection between reactionary religion in America and these groups that espouse other forms of bigotry.
What is the disconnect at the core between this religious nationalism and those that believe in that and the very idea of democracy?
Well, they adhere to the idea that America was founded as a so-called Christian nation, and they assert that it's their right to take it back. And I think that, I think for a lot of them, they say that any ruler that doesn't sort of adhere to their agenda is illegitimate because they see the basis of the United States, not our Constitution or our long but imperfect history of appealing to the principles of equality and pluralism, but a fidelity to their vision. So they see anybody who's not with them as somehow hostile to them. They've posited themselves as engaged in a struggle, an existential struggle with what they call the forces of darkness and absolute evil. So there's no compromise. But I think we also have to look at the fact that, this ideology really played a group in spurring these groups that overran the Capitol to action. The role of the religious messaging platforms and the religious leaders who riled up this cohort long before January 6th. They cast the consequences of a very fairly and decided election as a farce, as they perpetuated this lie that it had been stolen. Even every investigation that had been done into the different states yielded nothing, but yet they persisted with this fraudulent narrative, and that's part of the way that they enabled this group to overrun the Capitol and to mount an attack on Congress and the Capitol building and on the election. These are the foundational institutions of our democracy.
And what is the nexus between this biblical worldview that you talk about and that Hawley has talked about in the past in speeches that he's given, and ways in which it supports the idea of fostering these lies, and the way it's antithetical to any kind of democratic governance that doesn't have religion and Christianity as its base?
Well, the rhetoric of religious nationalism is apocalyptic. It says that America is founded as a Christian nation. It has fallen to the forces of evil and secularism. And it says that we need to take drastic action to save our country and, quote, take it back. And that type of apocalyptic rhetoric is often a precondition for these sorts of radical actions. You can see similarities around the world. This is something that fascists, frankly, often do. They posit themselves as being engaged in a struggle between the forces of absolute good and the forces of absolute evil. And that's that's how it works. And I think at a higher level, I've written about how the movement is led from the top, and it's led not by some leadership cadre as much as a number of different organizations that are instrumental in setting the agenda and communicating the agenda to the rank and file. So we have to look at the key Christian nationalist organizations that were instrumental in preparing the ground for the assault on our democracy by feeding this conspiracy narrative of a stolen election. So, for instance, the Conservative Action Project, which is a group associated with the Council for National Policy, which is one of the leading networking organizations of the Christian right, they demanded spurious investigations and baseless, baseless allegations of election fraud. They sort of demanded that senators contest this election based on lies. And sponsors of the January 6th rally, which was predicated on that baseless lie of an illegitimate election, included groups like Phyllis Schlafly's Eagles, Moms for America, Turning Point Action, which is the political arm of Turning Point USA. These are right-wing groups that are headed by folks who are, I suppose you could describe as sort of, among the leadership cadre of the movement.
I guess one of the questions that arises is kind of the chicken or the egg question, whether or not authoritarians and authoritarian leaders are using this religious underpinning as an excuse for authoritarian behavior, or whether it genuinely does spring from a belief in this religious nationalism.
I think that's a great question. And I think when we're trying to understand the movement, we really have to distinguish between the leaders of the movement and the rank and file. When you're talking about the rank and file, this is a very large group of people that have a number of different interests and concerns. And, so when they're voting for political candidates who promise to end abortion or reunite church and state, they're often not making an argument for major changes in which the government is run. They're really kind of voting on their identity. They're making a statement about what they value in themselves and how they value their identity. But for the leaders of the movement, the leaders of the right-wing policy groups, the networking groups, the legal advocacy groups, the legislative initiatives and the like, they're not just about these culture war issues, right? They're not really about just ending abortion. A lot of it is about money. When you hear them talk to one another in the forums that they share in their strategy meetings, or when you hear them talking to their big, deep-pocketed funders, often members of these hyper-wealthy extended families, they're plutocratic funders. A lot of it's about money, frankly. It's about how the Bible favors no taxes or low taxes for the rich, how the Bible favors minimal government regulation of businesses and minimal or no regulation of the environment. These are policies that are favorable to the movement's plutocratic funders, but they're not going to get the rank and file to vote on those issues, are they? They're going to dangle these culture war issues in front of their faces, like abortion or, the defense of what they call the traditional family. It's really ironic. This is a movement that claims to defend the traditional family, and yet the economic policies that they support are making it so much harder for families, American families, to succeed.
And where does Hawley fit into this? And you talk about him a lot in your New York Times op-ed piece, and things that he has said in the past that are so consistent with this point of view.
That's true. I mean, I think he has promoted this narrative that we discussed earlier, that America's, founded as a so-called Christian nation, and that has fallen to the forces of evil and secularism, and we need to sort of, there's no wiggle room. I remember, the Republican National Convention, Don Jr. said, it's a choice between church, work, and school, and looting and marauding and godlessness, as though anyone who is not with them is not just somebody with a different opinion, but a representative of the absolute forces of evil. And I've heard this kind of language even in many of the churches that are part of the network that turns out the vote for these hyper-conservative candidates that the movement favors. So when I was researching power worshipers, I went to a gathering of Watchmen on the Wall. Now, Watchmen on the Wall is a group of tens of thousands of conservative pastors. This network was started by the Family Research Council, which is one of the leading policy groups of the religious right. And so they spend all these resources communicating to these pastors the issues that should vote in election cycles, and then they try and they give them tools for them to communicate these messages to their congregations. They know if you can get people to vote on a few issues, like 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote. So they devote enormous resources into reaching these pastors with the messages of the issues that should count in election cycles in order to reflect their so-called biblical values. They should become, values voters. And, the moment, so I went to this church in rural North Carolina. There were dozens of evangelical pastors in the area, and I was there with a friend of mine who is also an evangelical pastor, but takes a more, I would say, nuanced view of politics. So we went there, and immediately, from the moment we walked into this room, we could tell that this was not a nonpartisan affair. The election was cast between a choice between godlessness and what they called the forces of darkness. And it was clear that the so-called forces of darkness were on the Democratic side of the aisle. They quoted Ephesians and powers and principalities and all this kind of stuff. And, it was really, they were casting this election between, the Republican candidate, Democratic candidate, as a choice between, God or Satan. And that kind of, apocalyptic language is really common throughout the movement. It's really how they persuade so many of their followers to vote. It's like when a lot of people cast their vote, they're not just, voting for policy. They're voting for, their identity, which they want to see as on the right side.
You talk about this speech that Hawley gave back in, I think, 2019 at a small conservative Christian college, where he talked about some of this. Expand on that a little bit. Talk about that.
Yes, in numerous speeches and an article and interviews, Josh Hawley spoke about Pelagius, a 4th century monk, British-born, who advocated for, I would say, almost like a more moderate view of the faith. He said that good things and grace comes to those who do good things and don't just sort of submit to the correct doctrines, and that people should be able to discern meaning in the world according to their conscience, not just according to their fealty to certain religious authorities. And frankly, this is how a lot of folks in America understand our faith. We sort of believe that good works matter, and that, people, religion is this very personal thing, and we have an inherently pluralistic country, and that you can be a good person and do good things regardless of your religious affiliation. You can be, look, there are many different ways to be a Christian, and there are many other faiths in our country. And there 37% of Americans don't happen to be religious at all. And yet, people in all categories find meaning and goodness in their lives. And Hawley cast this as absolutely horrible, and this is just the wrong way to do it. But so here's what's really interesting. He also gave a speech to the American Renewal Project, which is a group that has long tried to connect hyper-conservative politicians with pastors and other Christian nationalist figures like David Barton, the pseudo-historian, the religious rights favorite pseudo-historian, in order to achieve political power for this movement. And he gave a speech to this group, and in which he sort of used language that signaled that he was completely on board with the most hyper-conservative, almost, I would say, dominionist view of our politics in our world. And, Josh Hawley in other forums has sort of offered a good game about, concern for working class and economic policy, and when people need to, have dignity in their lives, and it's true. But he's completely allied with this movement that takes a really hard right, libertarian view of economic policy, which is this movement. The religious right, in a larger sense, has really advocated for policies that are going to empower and further enrich the plutocrats in our society, and really degrade lives for most Americans.
And there is this almost dominionist view that somehow the church has ultimate authority, which is obviously antithetical to any kind of democratic situation.
That's absolutely true. I mean, the constitutional principle of church-state separation is baked into the first clause of our First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. And that's, if you look at what Thomas Jefferson, this phrase flowed from Thomas Jefferson's pen. If you look at all the writings he's done around wall of separation between church and state and the like, and the kind of back and forth that he did with the Danbury Baptists and writing he's done in other contexts, you can really see that the separation of church and state was considered an absolutely critical part of our founding principles. And it's never been applied perfectly, of course, and there's always going to be a kind of tension there, but it is a principle that has served our country, which is an irreducibly pluralistic, very well since our nation's founding, even as others have been torn apart by sectarian division. And we can see that in our own history, what's happened when one religious group tries to seize control of the public resources, it's proved incredibly and frankly unnecessarily divisive. And we can see it even in the 1840s when Catholics started to immigrate to America in large numbers. At the time, there were Protestant Bible readings in the public schools, which were considered pan-sectarian within the Protestant tradition. They didn't adhere to the Lutherans or the Presbyterians or the Methodists as much as be sort of pan-sectarian within the Protestant tradition, but they excluded readings from the Catholic Bible. And when Catholics started to immigrate to this country in large numbers, all hell broke loose. I mean, people fought and died in the streets over the issue of religion in public schools. And we forget this chapter. And in Cincinnati, we had Cincinnati Bible Wars over sectarian readings in public schools. And we had similar conflicts playing out in Boston. And it got to a point where Ulysses Grant gave a speech, and he said, the religion should be home, and the churches and houses of worship and the sort of family and schools, which are common to all. We should keep the church and state forever separate. So this is a principle that has been affirmed over and over throughout our history. It's a principle that has served our country very well. And listen, I think people can express their religious views and religious voice in public square, and include even, religious language in our national political theater while still respecting the diversity of our country and essentially respecting this principle of separation of church and state.
And then you have people, even you quote Bill Barr, the former attorney general, in your piece, saying in a speech that he gave that free government was only sustainable among those that are religious.
Yes, it's amazing, as though many, both religious and non-religious people alike, don't ground their sense of morality in other areas. Even many religious people do right because they understand the principle of empathy, and they understand, the do unto others principle, which is not a principle unique to any one particular religious tradition, but you can find in most religious traditions. And many people who are not religious seek to treat their neighbors and friends and others with respect because they empathize with them and recognize common humanity and respect that all human beings deserve to be treated with dignity. So yeah, it's a very apocalyptic vision. But I tend to think that there's something a bit specious about those allegations, because if you look at how they readily they threw themselves behind a corrupt sociopath, as though the sort of authoritarian vision of a corrupt sociopath was somehow better than ethical others seek to promote. It was really astonishing. I think at the end of the day, this is a movement that's not really about religion. It's really about the exploitation of religion for political purposes.
One wonders what Trump understood about any of this.
I think he understood that this group had a lot of power and that they have they have a huge get out the vote machine. They vote in disproportionate numbers. And he figured, he and his people maybe ran the numbers, and he thought, if I can get this on board, then I can win an election. And it worked in 2016. I mean, 81% of white evangelicals supported Trump. A number of hyper-conservative Catholics voted for Trump. And they did so largely on abortion, Mike Pence, and, those kinds of issues. They've got the get out the vote machine through data networks. They've got very sophisticated data through the churches. You can turn out like entire congregations to vote for your political candidate. That's how. Look, I mean, it's funny. I look at the work of George Barna. He's an evangelical pollster. And 2016, the most devoted religious rights supporters numbered only 10% of the population. 10%, just 10. But 91% turned out to vote. 93% of those turned out to vote for Trump. If you can get people to vote in those disproportionate numbers, and then you capture some other cohort, you're done.
What is your sense of how this movement will play out now that Trump is no longer there?
I think we're going to have to wait and see. Over the past 10 years that I've been researching this movement, I've been trying to keep my finger on the pulse of a number of different organizations within it. And I see a lot of sort of stepping back. I think people are regrouping and trying to figure out strategy. In the meantime, they're pushing the things that really work for them. So the religious right is really good at forcing people to take positions on unpopular issues. So they're going to sort of continue with that strategy, this disgraceful assault on our nation's capital, an attempt on the lives of members of Congress and Mike Pence. They're trying to both sides it. I see leaders continuing to condemn violence on both sides, as though, and then some are even pushing the lie that it was some other groups that had infiltrated these Proud Boys somehow, and 3%ers and the like, who had incited these assaults on the Capitol. So I think they're going to try and figure out a strategy. But I also see great opportunity for others who seek to look. I think our country functions best when we have two rational, functioning political parties. And I'm hoping that the extremists can be sidelined just because people won't give them the platforms that they have given them, and I don't know, in TV news and the like. It's not censorship. It's just nobody's entitled to a platform. So I think people make, decisions about sort of folks that they want to have commenting on these issues. And I think the radical right has been extended a disproportionate platform for too long.
And what about somebody like Hawley? Is it just political cynicism, or is he really the kind of, or trying to create a kind of intellectual underpinning to support this extremism?
No, we can't really know what's in anybody else's heart, can we? But I think if you listen to the speech that Mr. Hawley gave to the American Renewal Project, you'll see that if it was just a con, he took it a lot farther than it needed to go.
Leading to the conclusion that he does see himself as the heir to this. He does see himself as a leader of this movement.
Yes, he's, for me, a kind of representative of this aspect of the Christian nationalist project, where the goal is really transparently to reduce the mechanisms of democracy, of constitutional democracy, to a facade, and make way for a more religious authoritarian enterprise. But I want to stress that it's not about Mr. Hawley. He's a project of the machinery of the movement. So you've got, the Federalist Society combined with a wide range of think tanks, leadership training institutes, and these other hyper-conservative organizations. They're producing hundreds of Hawley lookalikes, and I think until we deal with the pathologies that we've produced with this far-right ecosystem, we're just going to get a new Mr. Hawley.
Catherine Stewart, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much. It's great to speak with you again.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.